Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is largely kind of an extension of what we were just doing, that you could look at percents as ratios, and the whole last chapter was ratios. So what's a percent? I'm going to say a percent equals, it's really just a ratio. And we wrote ratios a couple ways, but where ratios you'd have like one number to a second number, the key for a percent is that second number is pretty much always 100. So we're going to talk about this 40% down below. Maybe I'll jump to it right now, but you could say 40% is really the ratio of 40 to 100. That if you'd had 100 questions on the test and you had 40 out of the 100 right, you'd have 40%. The other way you could look at it would be as a fraction where the denominator is going to be 100. So this 40% you could also say is going to be 40 over 100. So the point is really that this thing here is just kind of what we had been doing in the last chapter. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. Then I suppose if we are talking this 40%, the other way to kind of look at it that might be helpful would be to say, I'm going to try to do a nice circle, see how I do. Could be worse, I suppose. That if you think of like one of those pie charts or circle graphs, whatever you want to call it, if we were to cut this baby right down the middle, I wouldn't do this in your notes, but this would be 50%, right? I'd do the circle, but I wouldn't cut it in half. But that's good teaching right there, my friends. Sorry about that. But you agree that'd be 50% within the limitations of your teacher's drawing? So 40% is going to be a little bit less than that, right? So you're trying to take this circle and divide it up into like 10 wedges, and then you want 4 of the wedges. So I'm going to say 40% is maybe going to be something like that there.
Yeah.
So that there would be 40%. It's up to you, but that's kind of another way you could look at percentages. It's this much of the whole. And if you can picture what percents are in your head without it, skip it. But, all right, ready for the next part? Converting between percents and decimals. So I have 3 asterisks here. This is really, 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 really important. This comes up over and over this chapter. If you struggle with this, it's going to kind of keep kicking you in the teeth all chapter long. But basically, how do you change from a percent to a decimal or a decimal back to a percent? You always move the decimal, so move the decimal point 2 places. In other words, when we have this 37% down here, for example, 2, 37%, you agree right now the decimal's right there after the 7, it's like 37.0%? So if we want to write that as a decimal, we have to take and do 2 jumps with that decimal point, kind of like a 1, a 2. So that's going to be 0.37 as a decimal. Fair enough? The question comes up a little bit, which way do you move it? You go 2 jumps left or 2 jumps right? So I want to just kind of clarify in that space up above. I'm going to put an arrow to the left and kind of say move it to the left 4% to a decimal. But if you ever forget, just pick one that you know. Such as if you have 50%, 50% is really just 0.5 or 1/2, right? So if you're ever confused on a quiz, on a test, on a homework assignment, well, if you know 50% is 0.5, then you say, oh, well, if I'm going from a percent to a decimal, I have to go 2 to the left. Agreed? So in other words, this 4.5%, so jumping down below again, 4.5% is going to be
0.0.
nice. That if we take and move it 2, it's starting here, we have to go 2 jumps. The common thing is people will just say like 0.45, the common mistake. They'll just put it in front of whatever number is not 0. But to go 2 jumps puts it out there, we need to have a 0 as a placeholder. And I maybe should put my zeros in front. The book always does that. I'm trying to be more like the book. But 0.37 or 0.37, 0.045 or 0.045. Now this next one doesn't have a percent next to it. It's just 0.48. So that's going to be what percent? Anyone?
Oh, 48.
Nice. So 48%. And if you want to, in that space up above, you could put the arrow to the right and say for decimal 2%. And if you draw a blank on it, you could say, oh, 0.5 is 50%. 0.5, to make it a percent, you go 2 to the right. All right, 2.4, what percent is that thing going to be? Nice. Yep, 240. You have to do 2 jumps. You don't just stop after your number. So it'll be 240, 240%. And my very last one is... Yep. So when you move it to 0.3 is probably the proper way to say it, or just 0.3%. 0.3%. Any questions on page 1? You know what you love it? Awesome.
Love it.
So we're close to the end. Converting fractions to decimals. And I'm going to take and just kind of do this both ways. So this first one here, change the denominator to 100. And then once you have that done, period, your fraction to a percent. So in other words, if we have this 17 over 20, if you want to try to change this to a percentage, this is probably the easiest way to do it. Number one's easier if you have no calculator handy. But we said the percent is going to be, I wouldn't write the percent sign in, but it's the percent over 100, agreed? So if we could figure out how do we take and change that denominator to 100, we multiply by,
The bottom.
not 50, but 5. So 20 times 5 gets me 100. So if I want to get the percent, if I want to get the number on top, I multiply that by 5 also, right? Just keeping it an equal ratio or making it a proportion. So 17 times 5 ends up being 85. Nice. 85. For me, in my head, I do 5 times 10, and then the 5 times 7, and then put them back together. So 85. So in other words, then it's going to be 85%. Yes? If you have a calculator, it might be easiest to do number 2. Just do the division and change the decimal to a percent. In other words, take your calculator, and for the second way, I'm just going to put a number 2 there. Maybe that'll help. If you do 17 divided by 20 in your calculator, it tells you 0.85. 0.85 is going to be what percent? 85%. Because just like we were just doing, you take and move that decimal point 2 places to change it to a percent. Work for you? Quick comment, and this isn't officially part of the notes, but maybe just a quick review in case you forgot it. If we have 0.237, do you guys remember how to change that to a fraction?
No.
237 over,
100.
how many zeros do I need?
3.
3. Yep, because we have 3 numbers after the decimal point, you do 3 zeros. So that'll come in handy in the homework. So now the very last thing, one's worth memorizing. Yes and no. If you have some of these committed to memory, life will go faster for you later. It'll be easier. So if you know that 1/4 is 25%, 25% is 1/4, half is 50%. So some of these, I don't think it's necessarily worth trying to memorize them. I'll make flashcards and put them in Moodle if you want to mess around with it tonight. Honestly, I wouldn't mess with the 2/5 and the 40%. Actually, nope, I'd probably keep that one. But I don't think I'd mess with the 1/6 and the 5/6. Those don't come up very often. But the other ones, if you know them, it'll make life a little easier. I would probably more just as you do some of these like common percentages in the homework, just pause a second and be like, oh, 1/3 is 33.3 repeating percent. That's this one right there. How about that? And just try to learn it that way as opposed to trying to memorize it all. So I'm done. Any questions?
Is the homework due tomorrow?
Yeah. Homework's due tomorrow.